Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to you lovely folks joining me here nice and early at Marvel Snap Zone. Welcome back for another weekly tier list segment where we break down for you the best decks in Marvel Snap right now if you're looking to compete at the highest levels of the game. Bit of an interesting week to have to make this tier list this time. We are just mere hours after the release of Hitmonkey and the brand new season if you're joining us over on YouTube, or if you have early access on Marvel Snap Zone just a few hours before that card makes its way into the game, which means this week we're kind of using the tier list as a testament to what the format looks like and kind of embodying the end of the season to showcase exactly where we were heading into the brand new season. The truth is, though, I'm not entirely sure too much is about to change without a very heavy-handed balance patch in the future, as we've made some small changes at Marvel Snap Zone this week, including the data from the tracker even more than we have before, and clarifying things even further than before. If you're looking into information as to exactly how we create this list, highly recommend checking out the original article in the description box down below from DenCCG, who goes over all the finicky ins and outs of how this is created in detail for you over there. But long story short, things are looking very similar to last week. In fact, if we're being honest, they're looking even more similar to the previous metagame before our last balance patch. With all that said, if you do enjoy this type of content, you're looking forward to the new season, do me a favour, leave a comment down below about how you're feeling about all things Marvel Snap right now. Make sure you subscribe to the channel here on YouTube for more Marvel Snap content, and do leave a like on the video for me if you want to make sure you're seeing more of this in the near future. With all that said, let's take a look at the tier list in full. As always, if you are looking for some budget options in Pool 2 or below, there are a few options available for you in the budget tier, well worth checking out. Tier 4 this week has a few more names than before, Negative Surfer holding itself here as a way to enjoy some people's favourite cards in the current metagame, and let Mr. Negative continue to shine if you're a player who enjoys that type of thing. Cerebro 2, an old fan favourite, constantly pops in and out of Tier 4, sometimes even Tier 3 of the tier list, finding itself available in Tier 4 this week. Kazucula making a slow and steady return, people looking for more homes for a recently buffed Red Skull. Kazucula proving to be one of the places you can enjoy playing that card. And Bounce to the top of Tier 4 this week, a deck that really does look to continue to improve as an off-meta curveball choice and likely benefits very much from the release of Hitmonkey. Tier 3 this week, Dracula Discard and Patriot Ultron trending their way downwards, proving to not really be able to hold their own with the rest of the metagame right now, and having more success at the lower ranks than they are at the higher ones. Similar stories here for DoomWave and Galactus, two fan favourite decks that will always see play in the game, but at the moment definitely on the outside looking in, and not really putting up the same win rates or cube averages as the rest of the format. Tier 2 gets narrowed down a bit this week, with us choosing to break down what we would consider to be low Tier 2 decks and high Tier 2 decks, because the gap between them is arguably larger than it ever has been before. Electro Ramp, Sera Surfer and good cards DoomWave serving as very solid options if you're looking to complete that final minute climb, but definitely performing significantly worse, well noticeably worse we should say, than some of the other options above it. These are great choices that many players have been on for the majority of the season, and they are still having a reasonable amount of success, mostly through the comfort of those players. In the high level of Tier 2 this week, LockThor making its way back up. Similar results to this one as the other Lockjaw decks you're going to see in just a moment. Card continuing to shine as more people are figuring out what that deck is supposed to look like following the most recent balance patch. Zabu Devil Darkhawk staying roughly where it was before, not changing all too much this week. But the big story of the week is going to be very obvious to you now. Thanos Lockjaw ongoing at the very top of Tier 2 as the emerging way to play Thanos that might very well rival its Tier 1 counterpart. You heard me right. Thanos Lockjaw has risen from the ashes back to a Tier 1 berth after a very unsavoury performance in the first week of the new metagame. People have adapted to the changes, and the version including Death and Killmonger now proving to be a real contender when you study the data. Joining it in Tier 1 this week, Sera Control remains a very viable option at the top of the metagame if you enjoy a more reactive game plan, but to the surprise of basically no one, Shuri Shuri Zero remains the pivotal revolving point of the current metagame, with nearly every deck having success having to be built to have a plan against this monster of a deck. This week's silent performance of the week is a bit smaller than before because it's very much a case of two decks that are designed to annoy Shuri Zero. Both of these control builds are focused on limiting where the opponent is able to play, and they're able to dominate a single lane through powerful abilities. The Thanos control deck has arguably made more strides recently, but the Devil Dinosaur control deck could be considered a solid pull 3 option that follows a similar logic. With both decks, you're looking to take over a lane with your disruptive tools and compete on another one through raw points. The Thanos control deck uses some cards from the Bounce archetype, noticeably Bishop and Beast, and with Hitmonkey becoming available very soon, we're of course eager to know the potential of the deck. As you can see in the rankings, Bounce is doing a middling job overall, and we would attribute some of that to the build being more difficult to pilot than the average deck in Marvel Snap, but if we pair it with some control tools in the near future, the deck may very well perform much better. So let's start breaking down the best decks in the game right now for you, one at a time. We'll start things off with the most obvious at the very top, Shuri Zero remaining a absolute juggernaut for another week. Even if the metagame seems to be trying to find ways to dethrone this deck, it is solidly anchored at the top spot for now. More than anything, it's the ability to make good snap and retreat decisions based almost entirely on your own hands that makes this deck so simple to perform with. Even if Thanos Lockjaw took back the best win rate in the game this week, Shuri Zero still retained the best cube average overall. Considering the deck's popularity representing more than 10% of the metagame at any given rank of your choice, maintaining that level of performance shows the deck is not just good, but great, regardless of the environment you're playing in. There have been a few interesting developments this week. The return of Thanos Death, which was previously one of the few bad matchups for Shuri Zero, and the increasing popularity of Iceman and Goose have definitely rattled the deck a little bit, and we look forward to seeing how that develops going into the new season, but Cosmo does seem to have kept the deck safe from the Valkyrie invasion that we began to witness last week. Thanos Death Lockjaw represented less than 4% of the metagame, while Shuri Zero was over 12% and Sera Control at 13%, so the surprise factor could definitely have worked in favour of this deck this week, but nevertheless, Lockjaw and Death soared in their win rates, each card hitting a staggering 59% and taking the top spot in that category this week. These percentages are higher than even Shuri and Zero's. Before the patch, this variant of Thanos Lockjaw was considered to be the counter to the much more popular build and appeared mostly in tournaments. In the coming week, we're going to see how big it's able to grow when the premier play to build around Thanos and Lockjaw comes back into the light. Sera Control is our last Tier 1 deck of the week, and its win rate is arguably on par with most decks in Tier 2, but the deck's ability to rack up cubes against an overconfident opponent still appears to be unmatched. If we look at just the win rates, Shuri Zero is 4% ahead of Sera Control, a difference worthy of almost 2 entire tiers in a different game. However, if we look at the cube average, Sera Control is just 0.05% behind Shuri Zero, a testament to the deck's ability to make each win count way more than its losses. The big difference between the two most popular decks in the game is the consistency depending on a collection level. Sera Control is particularly strong for players who are below collection level 4000, but past that mark, Shuri Zero retains most of its power, and Sera Control begins to feel like a mid-tier 2 deck. The deck seems to have 10 of its cards locked in place, and Enchantress seems to be back for good right now. Considering the ongoing synergy is going strong, the card definitely feels like it's worth a spot, and the flexible cards this week are the Hood and Carnage, who have been replacing Valkyrie and Mr. Sinister from last week's build. Depending on whether you're trying to have a well-rounded deck or a more targeted approach, these last two spots are very much up in the air. Moving down into tier number 2, Thanos Lockjaw Ongoing is showing up in force, with Cosmo showing up in a ton of decks and featuring very few cards that are vulnerable to Shang-Chi. The ongoing synergy is a great one to play in the current environment. This week, this build mixed with the Thanos Ongoing Zoo deck in terms of results, since both of them have 10 cards in common. Killmonger being featured in a few archetypes, mostly the death version of the deck, DoomWave, and even Sera Surfer, still appears to limit Thanos' ability to compete for a tier 1 spot all by itself, but even so, the deck has had a great resurgence after it started to feel very abandoned in our previous week's report. Zabu Devil Darkhawk remains a reasonable choice in the current metagame. It's always been a solid choice, although it never manages to quite challenge that tier 1 berth since Zabu was nerfed. Lockjaw picked up a lot of popularity towards the end of the season here, so shuffling rocks in has been very helpful in those matchups. Otherwise, the deck really hasn't changed much from its usual recipe, and it seems to be anchored as a high tier 2 deck for the foreseeable future. LockThor is proving itself to be a viable contender for players who are Series 3 complete. I don't fully understand why there aren't more decks using Iceman in order to disrupt Shuri Zero, but the addition of the card here seems to have worked very well for this pool 3 build of Lockjaw this week. Of course, this deck is still admittedly in the shadow of its Thanos alternative, mostly because of the high roll potential of both decks. Nevertheless, any deck finding a tiny bit of an edge against Shuri Zero should definitely be rising in the rankings this week overall. Another card that's worth mentioning here is Dracula, a great way to get points into play without fearing Shang-Chi, a card that is in almost every deck right now. It's been a bit of a difficult week for DoomWave after it rose to top tier status right after the patch. The archetype remains in the discussion of the current great decks in Marvel Snap, but it could start lacking that surprising trait that is often so important for stealing cubes from careless opponents. The increased popularity of a deck like Electro Ramp could also have hurt this deck, as Sandman remains one of the best wave counters in the game. Without the ability to play the expected She-Hulk in addition to a strong 6-cost card, the meager 3 points wave contributes to a location on turn 5 is a bit of a problem. Sera Surfer slowly finding its way back into the metagame as well this week. Silver Surfer really isn't able to compete in a point shootout since it was nerfed, but you probably already knew that. This deck is packing a few interesting abilities in order to be very annoying for other decks in the current metagame. Goose, Juggernaut, and Storm are solid cards against Shuri Zero, either by limiting where the opponent can play with Goose and Storm, and trying to send Taskmaster into the same lane as Red Skull with Juggernaut. Indeed, if the opponent cannot play Taskmaster where Cosmo and Goose are, we usually have a decent read on where it's going to end up. As for the other matchups, Killmonger, Cosmo, and Polaris are still great Marvel Snap cards, and they give this deck a fighting chance against the rest of the field. Electro Ramp remains a great deck among Pool 3 players since Sandman has finally established itself as a primary counter to Sera Control and other explosive strategies, including some ones on the way courtesy of Hitmonkey. Unfortunately, Electro Ramp suffers a lot from Shuri Zero being about a fifth of the total metagame, as you really don't have much game into that deck's play patterns. For a second week in a row, it seems like the standalone cards have performed better than the more synergistic versions of this deck, including things like Nimrod and Destroyer, or Black Panther and Arnim Zola. The deck could definitely stand to climb a few more ranks on this list if everyone's settled on the best list available. Down in Tier 3, Galactus still finds itself kind of languishing, and every single week it creates a controversy in our rankings as the archetype that still has very hardcore fans who aren't satisfied with anything less than a Tier 1 berth based on their own results. However, with a huge uptick in Cosmo, Goose, and Polaris, and Aero not being completely gone either, it's difficult to see Galactus as more than a good deck in the wrong environment. If we're talking about raw power alone, where the environment didn't matter, Galactus could definitely be much higher in our rankings, but unfortunately for the Devourer of Worlds, that's just not how it works. Deathwave finds itself as a defendable choice that really hasn't moved very much in quite a long time. When the most popular deck in the game is running both Armor and Cosmo, it's quite difficult to climb much higher than Tier 3 for a deck like Deathwave. The deck has been a staple in the Marvel Snap game for more than 6 months now, so we have no doubts that it will bounce back or at least stay relevant in one way or another. But until Shuri Zero takes some form of hit, this one's likely going to remain in Tier 3 or worse. For a reason I can't really explain, the hybrid Patriot list from last week had a terrible showing in the infinite ranks. The deck was solid in the ranks leading up to the last floor, but it becomes a terrible pick once you're there. As a result, the more traditional Patriot build, usually considered to be more predictable, has had better numbers across the board this week. If Thanos Lockjaw is rising in popularity as word of the death variant is getting around, it wouldn't be impossible to see Patriot gain some momentum as well. This deck is one of the few that can embrace the popularity of Leech in the current metagame. That said, the Ultron version of this deck is definitely a little softer to a card like Killmonger, so we look forward to seeing which version of the deck performs best in the near future. Dracula Discard is taking a tumble once again this week. Even if Thanos Lockjaw isn't super popular, just a little bit of Leech is enough to be bad news for Dracula Discard. The card is also featured in Electro Ramp at times as well, another popular deck this last week. And lastly, Cosmo is increasing even more so to counter Shang-Chi in the current metagame. The card was already a staple in Shuri Zero, but it being picked up by decks including Sera Surfer, Patriot and Devil Dinosaur is making it even worse for a deck like Dracula Discard. I'm certainly not enjoying being the bearer of bad news recently, just basically having to come up here each week and tell you the metagame has not really managed to adjust to its biggest contenders, but there is potentially light at the end of the tunnel as the new season begins and a card like Hitmonkey enters its way into the game. Decks like Bounce should in theory have a number of tools to be an annoying opponent for Shuri Zero on paper, as cards like Iceman are great against the metagame Tyrant, and playing it several times is even better. Goose, Valkyrie, Shang-Chi, they all serve as flexible tools in a deck like that, but the bottom line is, if Hitmonkey had released in last week's metagame, the one we had right after the patch, he could have made a huge splash in Marvel Snap, but it is definitely a card that screams, keep me in your hand until turn 6, and we know what Leech is capable of doing to those cards. Also, Killmonger is known to be a decent card against archetypes that are relying on one-cost cards as their primary fuel, and as a result, if Thanos Lockjaw is back for real, Bounce could have even more to worry about than just avoiding the occasional Sandman played on turn number 4. If one wasn't so invested in Marvel Snap, the new season would be quite an interesting puzzle to solve. We have a new archetype using a Season Pass card as well as two strong and established archetypes, one feeling favoured and the other representing a problem. Off to the side, Sandman acts as a big bad in the shadows, ready to counter you if you become too popular. Finish the picture with half a dozen decks ranging across various synergistic archetypes, and the Animals Assemble season just sounds like it should be a hoot all round. But the interesting puzzle is one we already solved back in February and March, and it already cost us Modok and Nimrod. I don't know about you, but I'd like a new puzzle, please. If you have a different opinion on this whole take, this whole shebang, I'd love to let me know what you feel about how this is going to pan out. Please do consider sharing it with us in the comment section down below. You can reach out over on Twitter if you prefer, at Marvel Snap Zone, then CCG, or HowlingMines to get in touch with the team overall. Last but not least, you can come and join us in the community Discord if you like. Come and talk all things Marvel Snap 24 hours a day with a link in the description box for you down below. But until next time, hopefully Animals Assemble is going to be treating you well to start with. I've been HowlingMines, you have been amazing, and this has been Marvel Snap Zone. Take care of yourself. Have a good one.